at this point, the New York Times has had 3 reporters over the span of a couple of weeks getting to the bottom of the story about a Revolutionary War historic George Washington designed flag flying at the home of a Supreme Court justice. The New York Times crack investigative reporting staff is all over the most important story facing our nation right now. And no, I don't mean the newfound revelations that people working with and for Anthony Fauci in the in the National Institute of Health actually deleted emails regarding gain of function research in Wuhan, and specifically in their emails to each other talked about deleting them so that they can't be discovered in FOIA requests. No, actually, the New York Times has nobody working on that story or investigating that story or trying to come up with answers about criminal activities at the National Institute of Health, covering up what they knew about COVID-19, when they knew it, and whether your tax dollars actually paid for the virus that ended up killing hundreds of thousands of your fellow countrymen. No, they're not covering that. They're covering a flag being flown outside of a Supreme Court justice's home. 2 flags, actually. One of them, a historic Revolutionary War emblem that goes back to George Washington. That would be an appeal to heaven with a pine tree. See, back in the Revolutionary War, before the war even began in 1775, before he was the commander of our armed forces, George Washington knew that we were going to need a navy to effectively win the war against England. So he personally commissioned 6 vessels. They needed an emblem because we weren't a country yet. And so he created a flag with a pine tree on it that said an appeal to heaven. In fact, that flag continues to be the maritime flag and emblem for the state of Massachusetts. And any vessel associated with the state of Massachusetts National Guard or any part of their state fleet, they fly that flag. But of course, now we've been told that it's a racist, hate-mongering emblem. And this is the story the New York Times is all over. Oh, the second flag in question is the American flag, but flown upside down as a universal symbol of crisis, that there's a major problem here. That's the upside-down American flag. So here's the latest article written in the New York Times. The Alitos, the neighborhood clash in the upside-down flag. Inside the escalating conflict on a bucolic suburban street that Justice Alito said prompted a Stop the Steal symbol at his home. And there's Mrs. Alito, Martha Ann Alito, and the other neighbor. Boy, is she straight out of Central Casting. She is Emily Baden. And she's the one who got into a neighborhood spat. Does she look like every woman on every suburban block right now that would run across the street and scream at you for walking on the sidewalk alone without a mask on during the pandemic? Her name's Martha Ann, not Karen. Oh, excuse me. Her name is Emily, not Karen. But you'd be forgiven. Jodi Kantor is the byline here in the New York Times. Jodi Kantor, who has been reporting on the Supreme Court and the controversial flags outside Justice Alito's home, welcomes tips. By the way, Jodi Kantor reporting on the Supreme Court. Is she reporting on the illegal demonstrations outside the homes of conservative justices having to do with the Roe v. Wade decision from a couple of years ago? Those are felonies, federal crimes. You're not allowed to protest in front of Supreme Court justices' homes, but Merrick Garland has not done anything about it. In fact, the protests got so bad outside Brett Kavanaugh's home that they arrested a guy. He had like kidnapping and murder paraphernalia in a backpack outside Kavanaugh's home. They finally got him. He's the only one, but they continue to allow the protests on a regular basis. But Jodi Kantor, she doesn't have time to focus on that. She needs to talk about a neighborhood squabble and a flag that was flown. I'm going to read a little bit of this article just so you can sort of get the flavor of what readers of the New York Times are being told is the most important thing they got to worry about right now. The police in Fairfax County, Virginia, received an unusual phone call on February 15th, 2021. We're going back to 2021, guys. 3 years ago. Young couple claimed they were being harassed by the wife of a Supreme Court justice. Quote, somebody in a position of authority needs to talk to her and make her stop, said the 36-year-old man making the complaint. According to a recording of the call reviewed by the New York Times, the officer on the line responded that there was little the police could do because yelling was not a crime. We don't have a picture of the 36-year-old man in question. Later in the article, it's revealed that he wants anonymity because whatever job he has here in Washington, D.C., prohibits him from being public with his politics. But I think based on everything we know about him, based on his wife, and based on the fact that he called the police and said someone in authority needs to talk to her and make her stop yelling, I think we can connect the dots on what kind of dude this guy is. The couple placed the call after a series of encounters with Martha Ann Alito, wife of Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr., that had gone from uneasy to ugly. That day, Emily Baden, whose boyfriend, now husband, contacted the police, had traded accusations with Mrs. Alito, who lived down the street. In a recent interview, Ms. Baden admitted to calling her a lewd epithet. Let me tell you what that epithet was. It begins with the letter C. It's spelled like can't, but there's no apostrophe and a different vowel. Got it? Let me just show you her picture again. There she is. She's the one who called this elderly woman a word that I certainly wouldn't use. The clash between the wife of a conservative Supreme Court justice, a couple who are in their 30s, liberal and proud of it. I like that. So you see, the Supreme Court justice and his wife, they're just conservative. But these two in their 30s who are calling an elderly woman the epithet that shall not be said, they're liberal and proud of it. Let me just tell you something about Alexandria, Virginia. It doesn't take a lot to be proud of being liberal in Alexandria, Virginia. Playing out over several months on a bucolic block in Alexandria. It was the kind of shouting match among private citizens at the height of tensions over the 2020 election that might have happened in any mixed political community in America. But 3 years later, that neighborhood spat, which both sides said began over an anti-Trump sign, has taken on far greater proportions. By the way, those far greater proportions are completely fueled by the New York Times. Taken on far greater proportions only because the New York Times has decided to make a big deal out of these flags. The Times reported this month that Justice Alito's household flew an upside-down flag, which had been adopted as a symbol of the Stop the Steal campaign in January 2021. The upside-down American flag has been adopted by people for centuries in this country, since we've had an American flag. It's the universal symbol for crisis and emergency. And yes, protesters have been using it, not just the so-called Stop the Steal campaign. Anybody who thinks that there is something seriously wrong with this country often utilizes that symbol. But according to the New York Times, this is it. This is the only instance. This is the only thing. The justice, who did not participate in the contentious neighborhood exchanges, cited the dispute as the reason his wife had raised the flag. Conflict in the Virginia neighborhood does not explain why a second flag associated with the January 6th riot, as well as with a Christian nationalist movement. Oh, I missed that upgrade. The Appeal to Heaven flag, which again goes back to 1775, designed by and paid for by George Washington, is now a symbol of Christian nationalism, which is shocking to me because I've seen all of the images from the Black Lives Matter marches that used that very same flag. Oh, and there's something else that's fascinating. After the January 6th riot, the New York Times themselves did an expose on the symbolism of signs and flags used at the January 6th riot. It's a great report, I guess, if you're obsessed with January 6th and you really want to understand the far right conservatives who are destroying our country, those freaking insurrectionists. They did a whole expose on this flag and that banner and that sign and what it means. They treat conservatives in America like we're some foreign country that have a whole different language and different flags and symbols. So they do this whole expose on the flags and symbolism and banners from January 6th. And guess what flag is never mentioned in the entire thing? The Appeal to Heaven flag. When they themselves did an entire report on the flags that were used on January 6th, they neglected to mention this one as the symbol of the insurrection. But now, because Mrs. Alito flies it outside her home, it's the symbol of the insurrection. You know, if it was the Gadsden flag, they'd do the same thing. Remember when the Gadsden flag, don't tread on me? I think that was designed by Ben Franklin. When that was used during the Tea Party movement, during the Obama administration, we were told that that was a racist, white nationalist, insurrectionist flag as well, even though a Don't Tread on Me emblem is flown on every single United States Navy vessel in the fleet. It's actually called the Navy Jack. It's got red and white stripes and it's got a snake on it, and it says, "Don't tread on me." That's not the Gadsden flag, but it's a near cousin to it. All right. Quickly now, and then I'll get to some breakdown of this article. Since these incidents came to light, Justice Alito has come under sharp scrutiny with Democratic lawmakers and legal experts. Oh no, they found legal experts to hate on a conservative justice. Don't tell me. Jeffrey Toobin? Just maybe Judge Judy? No, she's too rational. Calling for him to recuse himself from matters related to January 6th. That's what this is all about. This is all about January 6th, and it's about the decision about Donald Trump's immunity. And here's a really telling paragraph. In the coming weeks, the court will rule on two key cases that will shape how accountable the Capitol rioters and former President Donald J. Trump can be held for January 6th and surrounding events. The decisions are expected to influence his chances at regaining the White House this fall. Thank you for that shocking bit of candor, New York Times, because you're giving away the store. You see, these decisions that the Supreme Court is in the midst of making about Donald Trump's immunity with regard to January 6th will have an effect on the election. And we're really trying to interfere in the vote, and we'd really like the Supreme Court to get out of the way and let us do it. So one way to do it is to get Alito to have to recuse himself because his wife had a flag. Now, they go on and on and on in this article trying to dissect the dispute that occurred and in some way claim that there are lies being told about the incidents that led up to the upside down flag, because they are bound and determined to convince you that the only reason they would fly that upside down flag was to show solidarity with January 6th. Well, our pal Amber Duke, you may have known her as Amber Athey before her beautiful wedding, she broke down this article and compared it to the facts at hand. And let's take a look at her analysis. The couple the Alitos got into a spat with were a pro-BLM, mid-30s, unmarried white couple with a pandemic puppy living at their parents' house. Let's just acknowledge the amazing typecasting here. Again, as I showed you her picture, you've all met this woman. And yes, oh, by the way, one thing Amber left out. She's an actress. Well, a failed actress, an out-of-work actress who then moved back into mommy's house in her 30s with her boyfriend. It is incredible typecasting, Amber. You're right. The couple claims they didn't instigate, except they acknowledge that they put up an F Trump sign and then committed to keeping it up after Mrs. Alito mentioned she found it offensive. So here's the timeline for you that the New York Times doesn't really spell out in a linear fashion, right? It's the pandemic. It's post-January 6th. Biden is president. They put out a sign that says F Trump. Now, this isn't a neighborhood, a suburban neighborhood with children. And Mrs. Alito went over and said, I don't think that's appropriate. I think that's offensive. Not because of politics, not because of January 6th, but because it has the F word in it. And there are kids that don't even have to be a kid to be offended by that. I wouldn't want to go to my house on my street and pass a house that has a giant sign that has the F word on it. So Mrs. Alito goes over and says, I think that's offensive. And they kept it up because of that. Because she said it's offensive, they committed to keeping it up. They later added another sign saying, "You're complicit," which they say in the article was directed at Republicans. After January 6th, they admit again to deliberately driving past Alito's house to see what she was doing. And then they had the gall to claim to be the victims and called the police on the older homeowner they were deliberately messing with. That's what the article says. All right, a little bit more from Amber Duke. The article also confirms that a Washington Post reporter drove by the house, asked Mrs. Alito about the upside down flag at the time, and she confirmed it was due to the confrontation with neighbors. In other words, she's having this spat with neighbors. She's feeling a little uneasy. These people are unhinged. And so, as a show of defiance, she put out an upside down flag, which is a symbol of crisis. Apparently, Mr. Alito, when asked about this, got the timeline wrong. He said that she put out the flag because his wife was called the C word. Apparently, the C word epithet was told after the upside down flag, but Mrs. Alito says, no, it was because of the ongoing spat, not specifically the C word. And that's understandable. This was 3 years ago. Nothing in the article backs up the original claim that it was flown in support of January 6th. That's right. If you go back and look at the article, nowhere in there does it claim that the upside down flag was specifically meant to be in any way in solidarity with January 6th. Thank you, Amber Duke. Oh, one other thing we should thank Amber Duke for. Keith Olbermann responded to her. Keith Olbermann said, nice rationalization. The justice is a fascist and Mrs. Justice is unstable. And Amber replied and said, I understand why you might empathize with someone who failed at their job and had to move back home with mom. This is why we love Amber. Let me just reiterate that at this point, the New York Times has had 3 reporters over the span of a couple of weeks getting to the bottom of the story about a Revolutionary War historic George Washington designed flag flying at the home of a Supreme Court justice. They've had nothing about Anthony Fauci and members of the NIH deleting their emails to avoid FOIA requests having to do with gain of function research. They've had nothing about the $300+ million the Biden administration committed to a floating pier to bring aid to Gazans that was operational for a little over a week, and not one box of aid has actually been delivered to the hands of a person in Gaza. And now that pier has been destroyed partially by choppy waves, is floating out into the Mediterranean and coming up ashore in Israeli territory. And the pier has been shut down indefinitely. Haven't seen anything in the New York Times about that. Haven't seen anything in the New York Times about the complicit nature of the Biden administration's, their relations with the country of Iran, and having to put pressure on France and the UK right now to keep them from condemning Iran's march toward nuclear weapons. New York Times doesn't see any of that going on. But boy, howdy, are we going to get to the bottom of the flag story in Alexandria. All the news that's fit to print. I shouldn't complain. Their failure is why you come here every single day. And we appreciate it.